Hello, and welcome back to Learning with Lee. In today's episode, we're going to go over the different escape characters, or what are also known as escape sequences, that you can use within your strings in order to have different unique effects. And to begin with, let's cover one that we covered in the previous episode, and that happens to be this \0. It's also known as the null character, so you'll very often hear of null-terminated strings. However, this basically tells our string when to end. So if you look down here, I've already built and run this. It ends up happening to say this string terminates pre, and it stops right there before it hits the rest of the string. So that happens to be what the end of string character does. It tells us where to terminate a string. Fairly straightforward, fairly simple, very important to remember, and it's important to remember that at the end of any of these strings, even if we don't explicitly put one there is one there. Then, other strings, new line. And this happens to be one of these ones that's very important, is that you'll see this new line character and this carriage return character, \n and \r. And you can see down here how these end up generating new lines effectively, even though they happen to be different escape sequences. And the important thing about these is that the major difference between \n and \r is what they are used for in terms of Unix, Linux, and Windows. And that's because on Windows, and it might not be all programs on Windows, but I believe it happens to be for things such as Notepad, as well as also for WordPad, you basically end up having to do both \n and \r together to get a new line. Whereas on Linux or Unix, either one of them just generates a new line for you. So occasionally when you transfer files from one to the other, in case you're dealing with just plain text files that you are editing in fairly basic editors, you'll very often run into issues in which your new line characters aren't present and all of a sudden everything is on a single line, or all of a sudden all of your stuff is double-spaced when previously it was single-spaced. And that's because of the differences between how Windows and how Linux handle that. So, those are both very useful, very important in order to, because these are going to come up regularly, is that you want the new line, and it's a bit different than endl. Endl actually basically, if I hover over it, you can see how it does in here. It does this to basically put this new line character and append that onto the end of your string, and then it calls this, and we'll get into what all of that is in the future, but you can see how it's somewhat similar to what the new line character does, in which we're using it throughout all of here to generate these new lines down in here without having to expressly tell it, hey, I want a new line at the end of this here, or the like. So that's useful. Then there's two different types of tabs, and the first one is basically respected across all programs, and that's \t. And that's just a traditional tab similar to a paragraph. So you can see it down here where it ends up doing this here. And one of the important things to note with all of these ones here is that these do not need spaces around them. So you'll note that \t, I don't put spaces around. In case I were to put a space here and then a space here, you can see how right now, if I hover over it, it only lets me select that complete tab. But now if I build this and run it, and I head down over here, it's going to give me this character, then a tab, then another character. So don't put spaces around your escape sequences unless you want there to be spaces around them. So, because otherwise you'll wind up with additional white space that you weren't intending to be there. And it can mess up things like your formatting and how things are output and how things look. So that in general just happens to be something that you don't want to include that unless you intend for it to be there. Then, if you want to, and this is something that isn't supported on at least Eclipse and its console, I'd have to do a bit more testing to see if it's actually supported in the Windows console, but it is a bit of an obsolete thing, and that's a vertical tab. And basically that just, as you would guess, would end up, or at least should end up, causing a few lines to be put in here and then have this section of the sentence be put down maybe around here-ish, actually, rather than up here. But, as I said, it's not supported, and when it's not supported, or when it's unknown in terms of how it needs to display it, it gives you this little question mark in a box, at least for the Eclipse console. Then, in case you want to, say, have a quote within these quotation marks, because obviously, if I get rid of these quotes here, it's going to basically say, oh, you want me to stop at the second quotation mark, like this. And you don't want to put whatever's in here in this. So you just end up having to escape to basically say, no, I want the actual character of a quotation mark. So that happens to be something that is worth noting, that in case you ever want to input one of these, you need to have it escaped. For single quotes, they're a bit different. You don't actually have to escape them within a character string, provided that it's within double quotes. However, if it's then within single quotes, you do have to escape it. So that's a very important thing to consider. Technically, in case I wanted to over here, I could, similar to this, do this and just go with like char, quote, and then in here, toss in that, and it's not going to complain because it already sees, due to the way in which it parses this, the fact that it's within single quotes means that it needs to be a character on its own. You can escape it, and it has no real effect on it, such as if in here I just escape this one, and then I build this and I run it, you'll see how down here it doesn't actually have this slash in front of it. Either one of that or this, or how I had it previously like this, is going to generate that single quote or that apostrophe for me. So that happens to be a really important thing to actually consider. Then this next one is another thing that's not supported, at least by the Eclipse console, and probably not necessarily by Windows in terms of its console. So what it happens to be is it is this \a character right over here. And what it traditionally is referred to as the bell character. And what it happens to be in classical Unix and Linux is that it's basically there so that when you do something like a download or some process is finished and you want to notify the user, it just plays a little ding sound in order to basically signify that, hey, something's done, take a look at it. So it just was something that was there so as it has a fairly unified sound that all applications can use, as well as back in the days of early memory and not wanting to be able to actually store things such as, audio files, which are quite actually large files, especially in the context of early programming. It was much more logical to have something that was very specific, that was a universal way of playing that sound, so as that each program doesn't have to supply its own media, its own sound. Another thing that's not really supported anymore, \b. Traditionally, this has represented a backspace in some string. As you can see down here, once again, it ends up not actually showing it for this one here, but you may run into this in the future, which is why I'm including things like \a, \b, as well as depending on what system you're programming for, it can actually be useful to have those. Then, one of the major things is that you might be wondering, okay, well, how do I then get access to this \? Because if I try to just do a \ by itself, it's just going to escape whatever the next character is. So it might give me an error in case I try to escape something that can't be escaped, such as if I do \space, and then I go, okay, build this, run it. You can see how here it's complaining about the fact that it doesn't have a recognized character escape one. And then down in here, you can see how it doesn't actually exist there. It has the second space right here between these two here, but it doesn't have this character. And that's because it's used to escape. So what you have to do is you have to put a \ before a \. So if, for example, I wanted to do something such as a URL, so for example, HTTP, it would be then : and I want to do double \ for it, I'd actually have to do quadruple \ in here. And this happens to be something that you'll actually run into fairly regularly, is that you'll see things such as these quadruple \, or in the event that you happen to be navigating some directory, or the like, very often you'll end up getting a string. And one of the things you have to remember is that in case, say, I have something such as C : double, then it has to be a double \, not just a single \, and then it could even be something like, let's say I have something in program files, and then I have to do another double \ to see whatever's in there. So those are all important things to consider when you're dealing with trying to use \, is that because of the fact that they are the escape character, the one that signifies that whatever follows it is going to have custom coding or logic for it, it needs to end up being escaped itself if you want to represent it in a string. Then the final thing that I'm going to cover here, there are a couple of others, but they're all fairly obsolete and or archaic. And that happens to be \x. And this happens to be what is known as hexadecimal. And hexadecimal is basically a base 16 number, similar to how we went over base 10 and base 2 earlier on. So what it does is it starts at 0, and then eventually goes into characters, since obviously we don't have numbers to represent 11 just as a single thing and 12 as a single thing. So A all of a sudden becomes 10. B becomes 11, and so on and so forth. And that happens to be how you can do it. So what this allows you to do, though, is that if you look down here, these are characters that you normally can't display using your keyboard. But you can end up getting them by supplying their hex value in order to get those custom characters out. And for now, we're using chars, and when we get into what wchars are, we'll deal with how you can end up dealing with things such as Unicode, and for now, this is of course just using ASCII in order to draw these different characters and get what these characters are. And we'll get into the differences between ASCII and Unicode in the future, but for now, that's a good enough overview of what the different escape sequences are in terms of these, and these are things that you're going to see in basically every programming language. Because every programming language needs a way in order to signify that something needs to be on a new line or something needs to be returned. Some different ones might use functions to represent a new line, or you'll see things such as endl here. However, in anything that's based off of C, C++, C#, Java, etc., it's going to end up having access to these escape characters that you can actually use within your strings if you want to supply them within there. So that's really all I'm going to cover in today's episode. Thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful day.